Hello, my name is David Buchanan, and today I'm going to be talking about the Civil Liberty Project that I have been going over. I have chose the discussion of racial discrimination, segregation, and voting rights, and that is the start for the first slide. For my first slide and for the thing, I will be talking about the constitutional provisions. And that would be for the first part, I decided to do the 14th Amendment for racial segregation and for racial discrimination. This was the first constitutional provision put in place by the United States Constitution, and this amendment was also known as the Equal Protection Clause. It required the government and does require the government to have a valid reason for treating similarly situated people differently. This clause was ratified in 1868, 1 year after the Civil War had ended, as a means to prevent other states from discriminating against black people. So this could range from the southern states such as like Texas and Louisiana, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Kentucky, sort of those southern eastern states around that area that were still not the biggest fans of the Union and of Abraham Lincoln and of all the progression that was happening towards that time for the freedom of slaves. For my second constitutional provision, I decided to use the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was the amendment right after the 14th was implemented. The amendment right after the 14th was implemented was the 15th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which guaranteed and still guarantees the right to vote to all citizens regardless of race or previous servitude. This amendment was passed in 1869 by Congress and was ratified in 1870. Although on paper it said all citizens had the right to vote, which they did, it was made harder on people of color as they would have to take literacy tests, face taxation or poll taxes to vote, and especially this was prominent in places such as in the South and the southern eastern states, as I had mentioned before, that had adopted Jim Crow laws. This amendment, though, was later revised in the Voting Acts Right of 1965 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The third constitutional provision I decided to use was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a groundbreaking law signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson for people of color and of different religion and affiliation. This act outlawed discrimination based on people's color, race, religion, and natural origin in the United States. This act included several provisions that were meant to strengthen the newly formed act and law. These titles followed in order of Title I. They were prohibited, people were prohibited, and workplaces were prohibited from discriminating voting tactics. Title II required desegregation of public accommodations, so such as places, as I mentioned before, in the Jim Crow South that had whites and blacks separate of water fountains, bathrooms, buses, transportation, and just other public accommodations that were divided by race. Title IV required desegregation of public schools and colleges. So this meant more integration of blacks and whites both at public schools, private schools, whether it be elementary, high school, college, just all levels of school. Title V established the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights. Title VI prohibited discrimination by recipients of federal financial assistance. So people of different color, race, ethnicity, religion could no longer be denied federal financial assistance, whether that be from financial aid programs in college, that be from food stamps or other federal benefit programs. Martin Luther King was the voice and the leader of this movement, which ultimately led to his own early demise because of his own beliefs and his own actions. So we move on now to Supreme Court rulings. For the first Supreme Court ruling that I decided to cover was the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case. The reason I decided to cover this case was that it was a landmark Supreme Court case that happened in 1954, in which the justices ruled unanimously that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional and went against constitutional rights. This allowed and started the desegregation of public schools across mostly the United States, but more predominantly around the southern eastern states that still had Jim Crow laws under effect during the time. This was a breakthrough in racial desegregation as it allowed both white and black children to commingle in the same learning environment for the first time, which led to the desegregation of places in the South that still had Jim Crow laws implemented. So this Supreme Court case had a significant impact on racial racial provisions and also of guidelines of who was allowed in private and public schools, because during this time, and more predominantly in the South, whites were in private schools and had private funding from board members and from representatives, while colored kids and all these other cohabitants of like not blacks but like different ethnicities and different religions in different places had to either do public school or either had to be self-taught, which led to a major progression of an education in younger folks in the 50s and 60s. For the second Supreme Court ruling that I decided to cover Bowling versus Sharp. Bowling versus Sharp was a Supreme Court case that found that racial discrimination in public schools of Washington, D.C. were denying blacks due process of law that was protected by the Fifth Amendment. This decision mirrored the Brown versus Board of Education this decision mirrored Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, as both happened within the year of 1954 and both dealt with the segregation of children in public schools. Except with this case, it dealt with just the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C., that were segregating children in public schools and denying them their given due process protected under the Fifth Amendment. And then in this case, the court found that it was unconstitutional, as anywhere else would be in the United States that dealt with racial segregation in public schools. So this was another kind of landmark Supreme Court case that dealt with the segregation and desegregation of blacks and whites being in the same school in public and private schooling. For the third and final Supreme Court ruling, I decided to go over Griffin versus School Board of Prince Edward County. Griffin versus School Board of Prince Edward County was a Supreme Court case that was petitioned by a group of black students in the Prince Edward County in 1964 who alleged that the Virginia laws segregated schools, denied them their 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under law. This case was brought up as the white students of Prince Edward County were able to receive a private schooling when most public schools shut down between 1959 and 1960 in the area due to tax cuts, meaning that the black students did not receive schooling during this time, since it was most of all public schools in Prince Edward County at the time. African American students did not receive formal education from 1959 to 1963 due to this, which left many in the area uneducated. To match the inequalities and injustices, in 1960, the Board of Supervisors of Prince Edward County passed an ordinance providing tuition grants for the white children attending private schools in the Prince Edward County area. With all the evidence collected and gone through, the decision was 7-2 in favor of Griffin, as it found that these actions did deny the black students their 14th Amendment right and denied an education that white students were receiving. So we move on now to legislative and executive orders. And for my first executive order, I decided to talk about Executive Order 13985. Executive Order 13985 is a newly implemented order signed by President Biden that went into effect just in January of 2021, and is an order that is helping to advance the racial equity and to support for underserved communities through the federal government and to address systematic racism in our nation's policies and programs. This is a newly implemented order. It is still new, but it has the hopes of transferring undeserved communities across the United States and to help address the systematic racism that can still be felt and presented in our world today through the means of public transportation, through the means of public accommodations, through federal grants, through Federal Reserve, through many different just forms of government and programs and orders that are still going against some races here and there through the 21st century. For the last and final legislative and executive order, I decided to go over Executive Order 11246. Executive Order 11246, which was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965, is an executive order that requires affirmative action and prohibits federal contractors from discriminating based on race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and national origin. This order went hand in hand with the Civil Rights Act that was also signed by President Johnson just the year prior. This allowed workers to have job security and to not have to worry about being let go of a job based on their race, religion, and sexual preference. This is another groundbreaking order signed by President Johnson that helped African Americans be able to have job security and allowed also both not only the African American community to be able to thrive in jobs, but also rise in employment for them, for other ethnic groups, and for other groups of people that have different base religions. So this executive order went hand in hand with the Civil Rights Act just just a year apart. So within 1 year apart, both acts were signed by President Johnson to both help African Americans, immigrants, and anybody and everybody that wasn't white at that time. So yeah, thank you very much for viewing this slideshow.